He declared the war won in early March. He said the deal was largely negotiated in late May. He said this week that it could happen over the weekend. It is now June 2026. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Iran is still attacking targets in Kuwait. Fuel prices are hitting historic highs, and the deal is still not done. Tonight, we ask the question that cuts through every optimistic statement coming out of the White House. Is President Trump being straight with the American people about where the Iran diplomacy actually stands? And more importantly, what is the gap between what he says and what is actually happening? Tell us about the true state of this war. I am your host. This is the Daily Latitude, Season 2. Stay with me. Welcome back to the Daily Latitude, Season 2, Episode 1. And we are opening with a story that directly connects to where Season 1 ended. In our Season 1 finale, we analyzed why every American president has struggled with Iran structurally. Tonight, we zoom into the present moment, specifically the last 2 weeks of U.S.-Iran diplomacy, and examine something far more immediate: the gap between the administration's public narrative and the verified reality on the ground. We will cover 5 specific analytical areas tonight: the state of the diplomacy as it actually stands, the ceasefire that is not really a ceasefire, the sequencing trap Iran has constructed, the Lebanon problem nobody has solved, and the uncomfortable timeline reality that Trump's own Secretary of State has now quietly admitted. Let's get into it. Let's start with the most analytically striking feature of this story: the gap between what Washington is saying publicly and what Tehran is actually doing. Trump said this week that he and Iran's supreme leader seem to be getting along quite well, and that he would like to meet. He told reporters in the Oval Office that the negotiation has gone very well and that a deal might happen over the weekend. Now let's look at what was happening simultaneously on the ground. An Indian national was killed in an Iranian attack on Kuwait airport. Iran attempted strikes on U.S. military bases in Kuwait and Bahrain. Iranian negotiators had reportedly stopped communicating entirely in response to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. And Iran's semi-official media confirmed the memorandum text is still under discussion, with no response sent to Washington. This is the Optimism Gap, and understanding why it exists and what function it serves is essential analytical context for everything that follows tonight. Let's talk about the ceasefire, because what is being called a ceasefire in this conflict does not resemble any conventional definition of that word. This week, while the ceasefire was supposedly in effect, Iran attacked Kuwait airport, an Indian national died. Iran attempted strikes on U.S. bases in Kuwait and Bahrain. The United States attacked an Iranian-bound oil tanker, and Israel continued striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon with U.S. backing. Here is the analytical framing that matters. What the U.S. and Iran have is not a ceasefire in any traditional military sense. It is a managed confrontation. Both sides have de-escalated from peak intensity, but both sides are continuing to use military tools, strikes, mine-laying, proxy attacks to maintain and improve their bargaining positions at the negotiating table. Every military action is simultaneously a combat operation and a diplomatic signal. That is a fundamentally unstable environment in which to conduct negotiations, and it is the actual reality behind the word ceasefire. Now let's get into the most analytically sophisticated part of this story: the sequencing trap that Iran has constructed. Here is Secretary Rubio's stated American position. Step 1. Iran opens the strait with no tolls, removes mines, stops firing on ships. Step 2. The U.S. lifts its blockade. Step 3. Iran commits to negotiations on ending uranium enrichment. Step 4. Only then does Tehran receive any unfreezing of its assets. Rubio was explicit: no advanced signing bonus, no good faith front. That sequencing on paper strongly favors Washington. But here is the analytical problem. Iran seized the Strait of Hormuz at the start of this conflict. That single act transferred enormous leverage to Tehran, because the United States now needs Iran to reopen the strait more urgently than Iran needs anything Washington is currently offering. The longer the strait stays closed, the more pressure builds on consumers, oil markets, Gulf economies, and Republican electoral prospects in November. Iran understands this arithmetic perfectly, and it is using every day of closure as negotiating capital. Now let's talk about Lebanon. because this is the issue that could quietly destroy everything else. Iran has made its position clear. Any memorandum ending the war must include a declaration ending hostilities on all fronts, explicitly including Israeli operations in Lebanon. Iran wants Hezbollah protected under any ceasefire umbrella. Israel's position is equally clear. It will maintain complete freedom of action against threats on all fronts, including Lebanon, regardless of any U.S.-Iran diplomatic arrangement. And Trump has publicly supported Israel's position. Here is the analytical problem this creates. Iran's negotiators reportedly stopped communicating entirely this week, specifically in response to continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon, which means every time Israel strikes a Hezbollah target, it functionally pauses the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. Washington is trying to negotiate a deal with Tehran while simultaneously backing Israeli military operations that Tehran says are a precondition for any deal at all. That is not just a complication. That is a structural contradiction at the heart of American diplomacy in this conflict, and it has no obvious resolution. This week, Secretary of State Rubio spent 2 painful days testifying before House and Senate committees on Iran, and buried inside those hearings was an admission that deserves far more attention than it received. Democratic Representative Sarah Jacobs asked a blunt question: if the war is over, who won? Rubio listed the military achievements: Iran's Navy destroyed, Air Force crushed, missile launchers reduced, nuclear infrastructure degraded. He said, "I consider that victory." But then he said something else. When pressed on the comprehensive nuclear deal Trump has promised, the one that will end Iran's nuclear ambitions forever, Rubio was suddenly far less bullish. These are highly technical matters, he told the Senate. You could not work those out in 5 days. That would require a team of experts to meet over a 30, 60, 90-day period. Let's be analytically precise about what that statement means. The 2015 Obama-Iran nuclear deal took nearly 2 full years of intensive negotiations. Rubio is saying any Trump deal would be far more comprehensive than Obama's. But the timeline he is now describing is not the timeline of an imminent deal. It is the beginning of a very long road. While Washington and Tehran negotiate, the cost clock is running, and it is running for specific groups of people in specific ways. For American consumers, gas prices have hit historic highs. Oil executives and analysts are warning that crude stockpiles, which cushion the initial impact of the war, are now falling at an alarming pace. The next price spike may be worse than the first. For Gulf states, economies, tourism industries, and entire societies are being held hostage to a conflict they did not start and cannot end. Kuwait just had its airport attacked. For the global economy, the strait closure is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a structural disruption to the world's most critical energy choke point. Every week it remains closed, deepens the long-term economic damage. And for Republicans facing midterm elections in November, the political arithmetic is stark. High gas prices, an unfinished war, a deal that keeps getting promised but not delivered. That is not a winning electoral narrative. The cost clock is the most powerful pressure on Washington right now, and Iran knows exactly what time it is. Now let's step back and ask the deeper analytical question. Why does Trump keep expressing optimism that is not matched by events on the ground? There are 3 analytical explanations, and all 3 are probably partially true. First, diplomatic optimism as tactic. Expressing confidence can create psychological pressure on the other side. If Iran believes a deal is imminent, it may be less likely to walk away. Second, domestic audience management. With gas prices high and midterms approaching, projecting calm confidence is politically necessary regardless of underlying reality. Third, genuine belief in deal proximity. Trump has always operated on instinct and personal relationship chemistry. His statement that he and Iran's supreme leader are getting along quite well may reflect real personal progress, even as structural gaps remain enormous. None of these explanations require deliberate deception, but all of them produce the same result: a public narrative consistently more optimistic than verified facts justify. And in a democracy, that gap matters, not just for accountability, but because public understanding of where things actually stand shapes the political space available for the difficult compromises any real deal will ultimately require. Here is tonight's analytical bottom line. The Iran deal is not imminent. It may not arrive for weeks or months. It may require the kind of long-form diplomacy that Trump has publicly rejected, but that his own Secretary of State has now quietly acknowledged is necessary. The ceasefire is not a ceasefire. It is a managed confrontation with active military exchanges on multiple fronts. The sequencing trap Iran constructed by closing the strait gives Tehran leverage the United States is struggling to neutralize. And the Lebanon Complication creates a structural contradiction between American support for Israeli operations and American need for Iranian cooperation. None of this means a deal is impossible. It means a deal is hard, much harder than the public narrative suggests. The president may be right that it will all work out well in the end, but the American people deserve an honest accounting of what the path to that end actually looks like. That is your analytical briefing for tonight. No spin, no noise, just the analysis that matters. Subscribe, hit like, and tell me in the comments, do you think this Iran deal gets done before the November midterms? I am your host. This is the Daily Latitude. See you next episode.